Welcome to the Royal Society of Edinburgh's online discussion event called Local Knowledge, National Impact, How Evidence is Used in the Third Sector to Inform Policy and Practice Development. This event is by the Royal Society of Edinburgh and is in partnership with the Scottish Government. A very brief introduction to me. My name is Talat Yaqub. I'm a fellow with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I'm an independent researcher and consultant focused on equalities issues and have been working across the third sector for a number of years. It's a real privilege to be able to host a conversation about the value of the third sector, which is too often overlooked, and how we better understand and illustrate that impact. To briefly explain the purpose of the event, is building on the recent Royal Society of Edinburgh report led by Ray Perman on the economic contribution of the third sector in Scotland. It's an opportunity to understand better what the third sector, sometimes called the voluntary sector, sometimes called the community sector, how that's defined, what that means, and how it works in terms of gathering evidence and evidence use. Given the enormous contribution of the sector in Scotland, in terms of policy development and influencing, research, crucial service delivery, and as an employer of over 133,000 people in Scotland, it's important that its impact is understood and that it's given the recognition it deserves. It's also an opportunity to discuss what type of evidence we have access to, how we learn whether we are using it in the most effective way, and how we build that further to meet the ambitions across the third sector and indeed decision makers within Scotland. I'm delighted to be able to share such a brilliant panel today, and thank you to them for giving their time to help shape the conversation discussion today and answer your questions. We're joined by Stephen Marrick, from the Director of Evaluation Support Scotland. Stephen is the founding Director of Evaluation Support Scotland, and it works with the third sector and funders so they can measure and explain their impact. So he will have lots of very helpful insight. Not setting up expectation too high, Stephen, I'm sure you will meet it. Suzanne Fitzpatrick is the Director of Institute of Social Policy, Housing and Equalities Research at Heriot-Watt University. She specialises in research on homelessness and housing exclusion, working with many third sector and think tank partners. Much of her work also has an international comparative dimension. Thank you and welcome, Suzanne. Ray Perman is Trustee of Carnegie Trust for the University of Scotland. He is a former journalist who worked on newspapers including The Times, Scotsman and Financial Times, and he was Chief Executive of Scottish Financial Enterprise from 1999 to 2004. Ray also led on the Royal Society of Edinburgh's recent report on the economic contribution of the third sector. We have Bridie Ashraman, CEO of EBOC, Edinburgh Voluntary Organisations Council. She was appointed Chief Executive of EBOC in March 2021, and she has over 30 years' experience in the community sector and is able to give us both a local and regional understanding of third sector evidence use and implementation in Scotland. And finally, we have Audrey McDougall, who's the Scottish Government's Chief Social Researcher since 2015 and Head of COVID-19 Analysis Division since March 2020. Previously, she has led the Scottish Government's Education and Communities Analysis Division. Thank you all for being here with us today. Thank you in advance for your expertise. And I will try and ask challenging but helpful questions wherever possible. So we're going to kick off with the first question, which I'd like to direct to both Ray and Bridie. What do we mean by the third sector? It has so many different names. It's interpreted so differently and makes it quite difficult to often measure its impact. So what do we mean by the third sector? In what ways is it evidenced to be important to Scotland's economy? And what do we still need to know about its impact? Ray, if I can come to you, so you can give us a little bit of an overview of the recent report that you've also written that sets the foundation for some of this event.
Well, thank you very much for that, Talat. The report came about because the RSE was approached by several people working in the third sector, saying that the third sector is a significant economic player in Scotland, but is often overlooked by government. It doesn't get the sort of attention and special projects which other sectors, such as creative industries, for example, or tourism, often get. And yet, when we look at its impact, we look at the number of people it employs, we look at its coverage across Scotland, it is at least as important as those. So what we wanted to try to do was to highlight that economic impact, to point out that the third sector is a major economic player and has a contribution to make, and to try to get it integrated much more into economic policy in Scotland. Now, we ran immediately into the problem which you've just highlighted. We're not all talking about the same thing, for example. Some of us say third sector, some say social enterprise, and so on. And there are a lot of different components that make up those umbrella names. And when it comes to gathering statistics, that causes a problem. The Office for National Statistics, for example, uses a different definition to the one that we currently and often use in Scotland. And the Fraser-Ivalda Institute at the University of Strathclyde has embarked on a very important piece of work at the moment to try and bring some clarity to that, to try to get some figures that we can rely on, that we can put forward to government and say, look, these are figures on which we can build. So that is the beginning of trying to gather the data on which we could use to influence future economic policy. But I recognize that this webinar is going to be about not only data about the sector, but about the data which the sector collects, which could be useful in a lot of other areas.
Thank you, Ray. I wonder if I can just follow up a little bit on that. In terms of the report, I think just to set the scene, what did you evidence within that report for those who have skimmed through it, no doubt, when it was sent around ahead of the event? What did you evidence as being the impact that has been overlooked? So it being such a huge stake in Scottish economy, what key impacts were you able to illustrate in the report with the limited data that you had?
Well, I mean, for example, the third sector is a major employer. There are various ways of trying to measure that, and they may be compatible. This is one of the problems of definition which we have to try and bottom out. But something in the order of 90,000 equivalent full-time jobs is not insubstantial in the Scottish economy. When we try to look at the value added put into the Scottish economy, something like, well, anything between 3 and 8 billion, depending on how you measure it. What we could say with some justification is that it's larger than some other sectors which have been the focus of Scottish government economic initiatives in the past, creative industries, chemical industries, tourism, gaming, and so on. So there is a prima facie case for saying we should be a bit more included in those sort of policies. But just on a superficial level, any high street in Scotland will have charity shops on it. Often we've looked at that as, oh, that's a sad high street. It's only got charity shops. But actually, I'm thinking my local high street, the charity shops are pretty good, actually. They're very good at retailing, and some of them are quite upmarket. And they have a major role to play in retail, in the regeneration of local communities. And maybe that's something we could build on.
Thank you. That's really helpful food for thought. Bridie, can I come to you?
Huge thanks, Ray, and to the RSE for commissioning the work. I think it's absolutely tremendous. And thank you, Talat, for bringing me in at this stage. And I suppose I hope to complement Ray in the sense of actually having quite a local lens while being part of a national network. So I'm chief executive, as I said, of EVOC, Edinburgh Voluntary Organisations Council. In every local authority, you have what's called a third sector interface, an organisation that's there to support the third sector. I deliberately say the community sector, the voluntary sector and social enterprise sector, because often people know what a community is. They're in one, they know what a volunteer is, and it says it on the tin. They might know what a social enterprise is, and obviously some things might only be partly socially enterprising as well, maybe bring income through a cafe, but otherwise have income from other sources as well, such as grants and contracts and trusts and foundations. So what do we really mean by this sector? And Ray really illustrates the challenge of it. So the organisations like ourselves in every part of Scotland are supporting that sector. So we've got tens of thousands of organisations, over 40,000 organisations supported by the network of third sector interfaces. And I suppose I often think that we also need to move beyond the term services, which is sometimes used about our sector, and into community cohesion, which also links to the type of conversation that Ray has kicked off, that a community whereby people can actually build relationships, and that can include a community of interest as well as of a physically based community, are really powerful. Edinburgh is an example of a very changing city at the moment. It's an incredibly diverse city and one of the most diverse cities in Scotland. So our ability to actually connect across a changing city and people actually meet others within those new communities and new Scots is as important as actually deep work around disability, deep work around our older populations, deep work around young people. So for me, in addition to Ray's themes that he's raised, there's also the return on investment. So, I always think sometimes the story is the best way to illustrate it. The elderly person who's had a stroke, who's come home from hospital, and they have a befriender who takes them for a walk so they get their mobility back. And then they don't get back in through the door of A&E because they're less isolated. They maybe don't have a big social network. Those are the things that actually also are about the economic impact. That we are some of our biggest pressures in Scotland right now are through the front door of A&E. And I can't think of a more crucial moment in terms of a conversation like this. I feel a bit concerned, as many people said they were at the SCVO event at the Scottish Parliament last week, in partnership with the sector, which the term was used, the essential sector, a beautiful film created about that. But actually, do our policymakers and do our local authorities, NHS chief executives and everybody know how to really invest in the sector at the moment to get that return on investment? So I think it's a lot of academic data around that return on investment. I think we need to get better and more agile at using it, and to actually really illustrate that bit that it's not just services, it's a return on investment. It's also about relationships, friendship, community, all of these different sorts of things, which actually then have an impact on the economy because we're having better and more effective health policy. The Auditor for Scotland has just released a really key report, and the very first point in that is invest in early intervention. But I'm not so sure sometimes we make the best decisions, and that's why data is going to be super important. But in addition to that, the data we already have, and that we can actually deploy now to make for better decision making.
That's really helpful, Bridie. And I think what you said there about the evidence through stories is so critical in what you've said, because actually when we talk about what data we have available, often we're locked into statistics that tell us half the story. But in actually the example that you gave about prevention of having to access A&E, the befriending, the mobility, the support back into community, those things that are the stories that are often not well explained in data points and data sets, or often overlooked, is really helpful. And actually very nicely helps me move into the next question. So thank you for making my job even easier. So Stephen, I'd like to come to you for this answer, but also to hear from others. How can we ensure we gather the right kind of evidence, taking into Bridie's point there, to influence policy and practice in the third sector and beyond? What works well, and what do you think can be strengthened in that space?
Thank you very much. So I think when we're, as Ray very smartly said, we're moving into now talking about evidence from the third sector as much as evidence about it. And in my view, good evidence is useful evidence. So it needs to be answering a question, the kind of questions that you and Bridie have just mentioned. One of the challenges, I think, when we're talking about evidence is we don't always know what we mean. Sometimes in my work with the third sector, I find myself talking to public sector people and discovering they're talking about evidence of need or evidence of service use. These are important things to know about. But in the third sector, we are actually legally most interested in evidence about impact. What difference are we making? We are required to if we're charities, but we also want to because we come to work to make a difference. Charities are set up to do that. So we have lots of evidence about what difference we're making, what difference we're not making and could be, and who we're making a difference to and how that's working. What's challenging, I think, is that we have it in very small pockets. Most organizations, as Bridie says, are very small community-based organizations. They know what they're doing to make a difference. We may not know that collectively. And that doesn't always lend itself to neat data sets, as you rightly say, Talit. So it's about finding ways to get those individual and collective stories out into answering the questions that we need to know the answer of. And we can do that. Actually, what was quite interesting during COVID was how useful evaluation, reflection, learning about what's working actually proved to be. My own organization helps the third sector measure the difference it makes. And I thought, well, who wants to do evaluation in a crisis? We'll need to be closing down. The answer was everybody wanted to. Individual third sector organizations wanted to know what they were now doing online that they previously done face-to-face was working, who were they reaching, who were they not reaching, and what learning could they take into the future. And so there was a huge demand for really quick learning, both from the third sector, which then in turn has informed some public policy. Some of the work that Audrey might talk about actually was influenced by third sector learning from COVID. So there are good examples of that. And as you rightly said, what we need is a mix of stats and stories. The stats tell us a lot of what, but the stories tell us how and why. So we need a bit of both. We also need to be not too precious, and this may be challenging for some people on the call, about what some people think of as hierarchies of evidence. I'm not really that keen on this concept of a hierarchy of evidence. I think good evidence is useful evidence, and the kind of evidence you need to know whether you're delivering a good service to an individual in a community is different from the evidence you need to roll out that initiative to the whole of Scotland. So we need to be clever about what kind of evidence we use for when. We also need to be smart, and Audrey again might speak about this, about what evidence really does influence policy. We have a sense that it's economic evidence and big numbers. That's sometimes true. And sometimes policy has changed because the minister met somebody in a lift and decided to change policy based on the conversation they last had. Not always a good thing, but stories can make a big impact. And so having the right kinds of stories, I think, really matters. And we have had lots of good examples in recent times in Scotland about how policy has been influenced by third sector learning and evidence. The care review for experienced young people was influenced very heavily by third sector evidence. And the whole world of prevention, as Bridie was mentioning, there's lots of learning in the third sector. I think the real challenge actually is not evidence-informed policy, it's evidence-informed practice. We're not doing enough to get the evidence about what's working day to day into changing the way we do things, to address these perennial problems about too many people in E&E, too many people on the edge of poverty, too many people lonely and isolated. And we need to do more to do collective sense-making, to bring people together, and Suzanne, I think will talk a bit about this, using research as a lens to pull together learning and evidence. And there's been some good examples in my work, but we need more about how we bring groups of organizations together with the public sector to sense make evidence, I think, and to say how we can make a difference. Bridie mentioned New Scots. There's been some really good work by the Scottish Refugee Council about bringing really small New Scots groups together to say, this is what's working in terms of integration. So that's probably enough from me, but that's a sort of my whistle-stop tour of what I think.
That's excellent, really helpful, Stephen. I think particularly pertinent is how we gather that evidence and inform practice. I think that's a very important point, particularly to think about Scotland's big and often described as wicked problems related to public health and poverty, for example. Using the privilege as chair, Stephen, if I can ask you a little bit more about where you see some practice happening in the right direction in terms of informing the practice that is helping us understand and do something about the day-to-day delivery to tackle some of those big and systemic problems.
Yes, challenging question. We did some, and I'm just going to give an illustrative example. We did some work over a few years with groups of third sector organisations in Voluntary Health Scotland around the third sector's contribution to preventing health inequalities specifically. And we have some case studies on our website of examples of organisations doing really good practice around addressing health inequalities and evidencing that using quite a wide range of evidence, so a range of stats and stories. And I think what that illustrated, and they are just illustrative examples, is the importance of going into early intervention. Other colleagues have mentioned that. The bit about actually addressing health inequalities is not necessarily about talking about health. It's about connecting people to each other. It's about connecting people to services. It's about helping people to self-manage. And it's also about poverty and homelessness. And so that's a kind of vague answer, I think. But I think what I'm trying to get at is organizations knowing their place in the system, knowing their place in the theory of change, and saying, long term, we want less inappropriate admissions to hospital, we want better public health. My bit of this story as a small third sector organization is to help communities be better connected to each other and build family support, for example. And I can see my link to the long term, and I'm doing my bit well, and I'm measuring my bit well. I think that's what we need, and then a bit of connection between all the different bits of the system.
That's really helpful, Stephen. I think it illustrates that in all of this jigsaw, if we are holding well in terms of resources, evidence, and our purpose, and we're staying true to that mission, we link together to create the infrastructure that's needed here. Again, that comes down to that resourcing and evidence and that really strong partnership working, which we'll come to in a moment. Can I ask the wider panel if they would like to respond to some of Stephen's responses there, or the question in general about evidence, what evidence actually influences policy, and what evidence it is that we need. Would anybody like to come in there?
I mean, I can come in, Talat, but it'll obviously overlap with some of the things that I might be saying later on. But I will just come in a little bit on the types of evidence. I think there has been a feeling that quantitative evidence was all that matters: statistics, data, numbers. And it's true that people sometimes find a bit of comfort in having a number in front of them because they feel it's something solid that they can latch onto. But actually, what actually matters is what's the question or the problem you're trying to deal with, and what's the evidence that's best suited to help you address that question or answer, or give you insight into that problem. And I would say, broadly speaking, you always need a multiplicity of types of evidence for any particular problem. I think it's very, very unlikely that any one method or type of evidence is going to give you the insight you need. So, picking up on what Stephen was saying about, statistics and data describe what's happening, but they don't explain why it's happening or how it's happening. And you need other types of evidence to enable you to do that. But you do need that quantitative evidence as well, because you need to understand what trends are and what's happening across society. I think the important thing is thinking about how you collate and structure different types of evidence in order to tell what I'd call an evidence story for whatever the issue is that you're trying to deal with. And what sometimes gets lost in translation is people create a lot of evidence, but then they present a lot of evidence in a sense of, here's the statistics, and here's what the research says. Oh, and here's some economics. You need to bring it all together and create that evidence story. And that's what will grip people. That's how people can better engage. As you said, Stephen, people like stories. Ministers like stories as well. It helps people to engage with complex evidence bases if you work on trying to bring those different pieces of evidence together. And the last thing I was saying, you were just talking about scale. And I know in the third sector, you're often dealing with very small scale. So that's where there's really must be great opportunities for collaboration between different third sector organizations to bring their evidence bases together, to be able to say, well, what can this tell us? It doesn't all have to be exactly the same types of organizations and exactly the same groups of people, but with various issues of intersectionality, bringing different groupings together actually could throw some really interesting light on problems that one organization by itself might be struggling with. I'll stop there because I'll say more later on.
It's always helpful when there's somebody that's not me that's used the word intersectionality on a panel, because that tends to be my job. But I do think it's really important when we talk about data and evidence here, is about who are we talking about? And the more siloed approach we have to these things, the more those who are furthest away from access to power, opportunity and wealth are not captured in homogenous data sets. And often it's the storytelling that allows us to see the overlapping inequalities and systemic inequalities that otherwise don't get given the resources for some of that data collection. So hugely, hugely helpful there. Suzanne, can I come to you and then I'll come to Ray? Thank you.
Thanks, Tala. I mean, I was just going to basically say something very similar actually to what Audrey was saying about it depends on the question that needs answered, what kind of evidence is most appropriate, and very often it's a collection of questions and you need both qualitative and quantitative evidence to answer it. So it's really important, I think, that we don't think one is better than the other, or one is sort of the kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and say we only need qualitative, we only need stories. And in my own field of homelessness, I'll be talking about a little bit more in a little while. The issue was actually more we had overwhelmingly qualitative evidence and hardly any good quantitative evidence. So actually the correction that was required was more a focus on more quantitative evidence. I speak as a qualitative researcher, I've generated a lot of this qualitative research, but I recognised that what was needed in the field, as did many others, was better quantitative research. And I think we're moving towards a better balance in that particular field. But I think that's what's required across social policy and public policy questions, is good, rigorous evidence of both kinds.
Thank you, Suzanne. Absolutely. Ray, can I come to you before I move on?
Thank you, Tala. I'd certainly recognise Stephen's minister in the lift hears a story and then comes up with a policy. And for a certain period of my life, I ran a policy group for the Department of Business in London, and significant amount of our work was from civil servants saying, the minister wants to do this. Can you give us the evidence to show that it's a very bad idea? Which we often could. But the more substantial point I want to make is that often third sector organizations don't recognize that they hold data, that they have data. And that may inhibit the collection of data on their part. Stephen talks about evaluation, and evaluations are very useful and very necessary. But it's necessary to think about how the evaluation is going to be done and what evidence is going to be needed for it before the project starts, rather than at the end and finding, oh, if only we'd counted the number of this or that, it would have been so much more useful. So it may be that third sector organizations need help in designing their data collection, in recognizing that they have data that could be useful in policy making, and helping them to collect it and to structure it in a way which is going to be useful.
And that's quite a right challenge as well in how the third sector uses that data. And often what information we gather is so dependent on what is required by funders, as opposed to what is the information we would like to know about the work that we do. So it becomes more of the ensuring that we are performing, as opposed to actually assessing what it is that we do and the impact we have across the third sector. Just a reminder to everybody who is online that you can use the Q&A function to pop in questions, and I will ask as many of them as possible. So if there's questions that have popped up now, please do use the chat function, and we'll come to that shortly. I'd like to go to a question now about some of the partnership building. So we talked about, Stephen mentioned being good at knowing what it is that you do, what your position is and what your place is within that big jigsaw. But this is where the facilitation of partnerships becomes really important in some of that evidence gathering. So how can we facilitate partnerships between academia and third sector to better mobilize data for the purpose of influencing policy decisions? So Suzanne, if I could come to you with a very easy question, clearly, straight to you, please, about how we foster some of those really crucial partnerships?
Thanks very much, Talit. I think I'll perhaps speak to this question from the angle of, well, from the academic angle. I am an academic, so working with third sector partners, particularly in my case, my experience is mostly working with some larger UK third sector charities, and I think Stephen might be able to come in and speak a little bit sort of about sort of working with more the community sector. But my own experience, I mean, I've been running research centres in UK universities now for about 20 years, and most of the research I've done has been funded by third sector partners, mostly larger UK-based or UK-wide third sector partners, and particularly the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that's funded us to do a lot of work on poverty. We've got a big long-term study we do with them called Destitution in the UK. And Crisis, one of the main homelessness charities that's funded the Homelessness Monitor programme of work that we've been engaged in for 15 years now with them. So, you know, we've worked with a lot of other partners as well, but those are probably the two key examples that come to mind in terms of actual sort of long-term sustained partnerships. And I'm just reflecting on what has made those partnerships work, and both of them are about 15, well, actually longer in terms of JRF, but they're kind of multi-decade partnerships that we've got with these particular charities. And I think what makes the partnerships work is a combination of the third sector partners feeling that the academics, myself and colleagues in iSphere, have got credibility in the policy world. So not just that we do, you know, academic research, which is, you know, considered rigorous or whatever, but also that we take seriously the dilemmas, the policy dilemmas, trade-offs, constraints that there are in the policy world. So we develop recommendations which are, you know, feasible. So I think that's one thing, that credibility. I think the long-term relationship builds a sort of relationship trust with the third sector partners. So you really do, it's not just a sort of, if you have a one-off commission from a third sector organisation, it can be a bit contract compliance. You know, they've done a brief, you've done a proposal, you've delivered the work, you walk away. When you have these longer term relationships, you really do feel like you have a common purpose, you're working together towards common goals. That's much more effective and much more purposeful and much more impactful. I mean, all of the impact that myself and colleagues in my group have, you know, on policy has come from these sustained relationships, and particularly the impact that we've had around homelessness legislation in England and in Wales and hopefully in Scotland through the Housing Bill has very much come from the sustained partnership with Crisis. But another point I wanted to make, which might sound like it slightly cuts against sort of what I've just been saying about working closely in partnership towards a common goal, I also think it's really important that academics retain their independence within these partnerships as well. And actually, I think they have to quite fiercely defend it sometimes, partly because paradoxically, the value the academic has within the partnership lies in its independence. As soon as the academic partner is seen as just being a sort of mouthpiece of a particular charity's position, then the evidence that they produce loses its power. So what I think is really important to Crisis, say in our homelessness monitors, is it's very clear that it's an independent output, albeit it's funded by Crisis. They know that we will not necessarily follow their lines on things in the report, and that gives the joint partnership its power, because we hopefully provide the research which is sort of credible and seen as sort of rigorous and independent. But what they provide in the partnership, which is completely invaluable, is the Rolls-Royce comms and influencing functions way beyond anything a university could ever do in terms of scale, in terms of specialism, in terms of sophistication, to be honest. So all of the impactful work I think I've probably ever done in my career has come from third sector academic partnerships, but with each part, or the two partners bringing very different things to the table. And I say I have worked with, you know, I've done a lot of charity work over the years with different kinds of partners, but it has tended to be those partnerships with the national UK-based or charities with their big comms and influencing functions. That's where we've really had the impact on legislation and on policy. And I know that's, you know, that's a very particular kind of experience, different from some of what we've been hearing from the rest of the panel today, but it does reflect how we've managed, I think anyway, to push forward progressive agendas on homelessness in particular.
Stephen, I could see you nodding furiously to a lot of what Suzanne said there. Can I get your take on this, particularly with the partnership work that, of course, you're doing with many third sector organisations?
Yes. So first of all, everything Suzanne says is right. I totally agree with her, including, just to reinforce that point about the value of independence. And it's independent of thought as well as independence of organization. I think that academics can really bring brilliantly, both to partnerships with third sector, but also to partnerships with the public sector as well. It's that ability to stand outside the system and view it differently that's so useful. And in my world, I'm just sharing a link in the chat. Evaluation Support Scotland chairs the Third Sector Research Forum, which brings together research active third sector organisations, some of which are a bit smaller, and academics who are interested in research in and about the third sector. And so it in itself is a partnership in that it provides the opportunity for people to share research practice issues with each other and to create partnerships around doing research. There's been a particular interest recently within that forum to look at participative research. So there are a number of third sector organisations, YouthLink Scotland, Poverty Alliance, some others, who are doing really great work around enabling people with lived experience to lead some aspects of the research process, or all of it even, and good practice within the third sector that can shape learning within the academic sector, but vice versa as well. There are also some good examples of partnership around community-led research. The Scottish Community Development Centre has been doing a lot of work around that. The British Science Association has a fund called the Ideas Fund, and that matches an academic with community groups to actually help them do some research. So there's some really groundbreaking stuff. Some of the challenges in this area is the REF doesn't always reward relationship building. I'll just put that out there. So all the brilliant stuff that Suzanne talks doesn't feature heavily in what academics are rewarded for. So there's frustrations that I hear, not being an academic myself, from academics who are really interested in partnership and participation, not having that well rewarded within the system. And there's always challenges around funding, and that long-term relationship's difficult to get funding for. So there's challenges there too. But I think the more we can think about collaboration in terms of putting bits of evidence together and working together to solve problems, the more we can do that patchwork and tapestry of evidence that Audrey was alluding to help understand what's going on and what the solutions are to those issues. So that'll do, I think.
I think that's a point well made, Stephen, about the ability to be able to do these partnerships is about how these partnerships are valued, not just by those who are in them, but funders, universities, the academic infrastructure, full stop. The more value that's placed on them, the more effort, investment and time is therefore given to them. Yeah, that's quite right. Bridie, can I come to you and then Suzanne?
Going to be really brief, but really be focused in the sense of focusing, for example, on homelessness. I think we've got an enormous challenge in Scotland right now. Many local authorities declaring housing emergencies. So I think it's incumbent actually sometimes on decision makers to really come together around evidence that already exists. One of the things we're doing at the moment is talking about things in the future tense. And I think we've got big crisis and a lot of evidence. So I've just come out of a meeting this morning, which was looking at how local networks that emerged in COVID between organisations collaborating at a community level really kept people out of hospital, sharing that with decision makers around housing, both in terms of policy, housing and homelessness, and in terms of practice. So I think there's an agility that we need to get to with data as well, rather than speaking about it in the future tense, because we've got such significant issues. And I was speaking from a city where we have declared a housing emergency. 5,000 children 5,000 families in homeless accommodation. If we cumulatively look at that across Scotland, if a child spends 2 years in a hotel where they haven't got a kitchen, they're likely to get diabetes. So that's a really big public health problem. So I think sometimes one of our problems at the minute is agility, taking what we already know and applying it. I noticed in the chat there's something also about climate, very similar. We've got fantastic opportunities to invest in great climate jobs that actually they're coming now. They could be in communities where there is poverty, but we're not getting the connections across policy areas to really make agile use of that sort of thing. So I think again, one of the points in here which we've made recently as we've looked at some of the challenges sectors where individual decision makers might be going, oh, I can't keep that community sector open. There's a lot of, I don't know why and I don't know how, I don't know the evidence. Cumulatively across Scotland, that's really significant. We need to have an investment prospectus, I think, in this sector, because we actually do have a lot of data, and that it's not just about performance and transaction, it's about relationship and trust that can then come from as a result of the evidence focused on the big issues, homelessness, poverty, and also climate going forward. So yeah, I want to challenge to actually say, let's talk about the present tense of what we can use now, as well as continuing to provide the evidence, because I think it'll be substantial of that return on investment.
Thank you, Brady. Suzanne, if I can ask for a brief comment to this question, then I'm going to go to the last question that I have and then straight to the audience.
Thanks. I won't then pick up Brady's point about homelessness, because obviously that's my specialism, so that would take us off in a different direction. But I just actually wanted to respond to a point that Stephen made about academics and being, if you like, rewarded for impactful research. I mean, here I can, I think, voice a note of optimism that things are changing in academia. I mean, that's certainly traditionally been the case, that even the term policy applied researcher was used as an insult. I mean, when I started my career, it was kind of like, when people described me, which they always did, as a policy applied researcher, it was definitely seen as a sort of undermining kind of comment. That really has changed, and actually the ref is a big part of why it's changed, because impact case studies are worth, if you get a 4-star, which is the best rated impact case study, it's worth £500,000 to a university. So the universities are now very interested in impactful research. And I think that's something that might be worth third sector colleagues bearing in mind. And I say all of the impactful research that myself and my team have ever done has been in partnership with those impact case studies we generate. Have always been in partnership with Crisis in particular, but also other charity sector partners. And I think other academics are waking up to this as well, because the strategic incentives have shifted.
Yeah. That's good to know that it's going in a positive direction, and more of that is needed, although perhaps somewhat of a cynical direction, rationale for some of the direction, but we'll take it nonetheless. Audrey, a question for you before I move into the substantive questions from the audience. What are some of the trade-offs or risks that come with evidence-informed policy making? We as third sector often want to give you every story that we possibly have to be able to influence our particular space and the equalities work I do, a particular change in legislation or decision. But what are some of the trade-offs that you see, or risks that you see with evidence-informed policy making currently?
Thank you, Tala. Just before I come on to that, just to come back on Suzanne's point about impact, I also noticed that there's something quite positive around impact from academia. And from where I see it, I'm increasingly approached by academics asking me to write about how their work has had impact. And I'm always happy to work with people to help them to do that, to help them frame and think about how their work has had impact when it has made a difference in terms of policy or practice from the government's perspective. So I've just seen that happening more and more, which is, I think, a really good thing. So trade-offs and risks with evidence-informed policy making. Oh, there's a bit of a list, but I'll try not make it just too much of a list. But the first one is really timing. And you'll all be aware of this, but timing is so important. Knowing the right time to get something onto an agenda, knowing the right time to put your evidence forward, knowing the right time when something's going to happen. So that's a case of, almost, looking forward, looking at what a government is planning for the next year, looking at the legislative programme, looking at the programme for government, thinking about what's likely to be happening and when, and planning, your interventions and your communications as far as possible to align with when things have high political salience and they're up on the agenda. I think that's really important. Of course, there's a space for getting things onto the agenda as well, and that matters too. But really, it's being there at the right time with the evidence packaged in a way that can quite simply feed into the debate at the right time. Complexity is obviously an issue, and we've mentioned about different types of evidence, and obviously evidence can be contradictory, evidence can be uncertain, and we need to be careful not to always, we're not always going to be able to get perfection. So sometimes we're just going to have to run with what we've got. Given the evidence we have so far, this is what we know. It's not perfection. And sometimes I think we can get ourselves a bit caught up in that degree of complexity if we just knew a little more, if we just had a little more granular data, sometimes you need to just stop and say, well, based on what we know, we can move forward. We've got something we can work with. There's obviously the issue about viewpoints, and if you're coming from a lobbying perspective or you're coming from a very particular viewpoint. I think one of the people in the questions probably put something in there's probably a question about that in there somewhere about people's viewpoints. And it's true, people have viewpoints, organizations have viewpoints, researchers have viewpoints. Being honest and open and upfront about those is the least you need to be able to do. It may be that you're not positioning yourself as completely independent, depending on where you're coming from, but just being very open and upfront about, the perspectives you're bringing and the parameters that you're operating within, what's expected of you within your organization, for example. I think that's fine as long as you're very open around that. There are so conversely, and I'm going to say something here which actually sounds like an anti-evidence perspective. It's not. Sometimes innovative solutions will have very little evidence because they're innovative. That's the whole point. It's somebody who's trying something out, perhaps in a different context, and it's been tried out before. It's been tried out in a different way. It may be that there is quite limited evidence. And we shouldn't stop that either. It needs to be a balance between the two, between doing things that have a very strong evidence base, but also the ability to be creative, to be innovative. But if we go down that line of right from the beginning, putting in place the sort of evidence, the sort of research and evaluation that will help you see whether this new innovative approach is making a difference. And I guess a final point I'll make is just that point about partnership and relationship building. From someone sitting in government, I really like it when we can work with people to develop evidence. So less about us commissioning a piece of work or less about us sitting in the center ourselves and trying to bring it all together, but actually doing it in collaboration with other people so that we can look across the evidence base. People can give their different perspectives and we can try and find out what that shared understanding is. We may not agree with each other on all the interpretation, but we'll understand each other a lot better. So I think there's something really good about working in partnership. I'll stop there, Tala.
Thank you very much, Audrey. Hugely helpful. I'm keen that we move to questions that have come in for the audience. And whilst there are a fair number of questions, and I'm going to do the best I can to put some of them into themes so that we get as many questions as possible asked of the group. But one of the questions that have come through, and they've been written in different ways, but a good few times, is there is no shortage of information and data that exists within the third sector, or the preferred expression here is essential sector, as Bridie used. But actually it's perhaps the skills, the capacity, the resources inside the essential sector as to how that can actually be utilised. What do you see as some of the solutions for that, given the fact that there's a lot of the information, data and evidence there, but perhaps not necessarily the capacity or resource to do what the sector would want with it? What do you see as some of the potential solutions to that? And Bridie, this will be something that you know all too well, so I'll start with you.
It is. I think I don't know. I think there's something about power. So actually, when you're in challenging times, which we have been acutely with things like COVID, and as we come into some of the moments we are at the moment as a country, we've got less money as a result of not being in Europe. We've got challenging budgets across Scotland. Is to some extent about power. So I think I do think there are people who know there is impact out there, but they don't know how to balance those responsibilities and accountability then around power. And I suppose I think there's something there about actually really being able to hear from those and listen seriously to those who have got they've got the data and they've got the evidence and they've got the stories that are part of that. That actually mean, you know what, we can hear that you're going to help us with some of our biggest problems and we want to invest in you. So I think there's something there about really understanding the importance of community-led action as part of this process. because I do think we've got extensive data. So I think there's something there for me that's, I personally feel I've been in situations where we provided lots of fantastic data, but actually somebody didn't analyze it and then say, where can we do more of that? An example might be around young people leaving care. The person who, one third of young women in Scotland go to prison who've been in care. What could we have done 10 years before that? We've got loads of evidence. And then how are we holding people accountable? Where's the power for shifting that investment to say, this is unacceptable and we're going to do it? Now, there are promises about that. So then after that, it's about power to actually loads with lived experience and those in communities that can really make a difference, to actually say, we're going to do things differently here and you're part of the solution, and invest in what you do. So yeah, I'm keen to work with academics about some of that shift. And I'm just going to finish up with the fact that there is somebody at Edinburgh Futures Institute right now who's done a PhD in collaboration, because our ability to collaborate and be treated as equals, I think, is quite an exciting moment in the context of such significant challenge.
Ray, perhaps a question for yourself or Stephen to answer. We've got a question that says, should foundations and lottery distributors collaborate to determine what data should be in the wider public interest, should be collected and disseminated, and on what basis and what timescales, i.e. for purposes of comparison and learning? Are there big data sets that perhaps it's for foundations and funding distributors to put out into the wider public interest, where perhaps small third sector organisations cannot?
I'm happy to start with that. I'm sure Stephen has things to add. But if I just give you a personal example, I am a trustee of the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland, and we make grants to students, typically from disadvantaged backgrounds, to undertake courses at universities. And we have some very inspiring stories which we gather from people that we've helped. What we don't have is systematic data. We're over 100 years old now. We've been doing it for a very long time, but we've only recently woken up to the fact that we should be collecting quantitative data as well as qualitative data on this. But we're not the only people who do it, because other charities, some of whom we work with and some of whom we don't yet work with, but probably should, are doing similar work and reaching the same people and getting similar or maybe even better, I don't know, outcomes. And certainly we should be participating with them or collaborating with them in trying to pool our resources to say, have we identified a problem which is being adequately addressed or inadequately addressed, and what could we together do about making ourselves more effective on that?
Thank you, Ray. I don't know, Stephen, if you wanted to come into that. There is another question actually that's about the pitting of that qualitative and quantitative data and how we move that conversation into a more nuanced space about how do we do qualitative data that is rigorous, that comes across in the way that that changes thinking, policy, moving away from the idea that one is pitted against the other, but that both are required, and that the investment and the nuance around qualitative data needs more rigor and resourcing. Stephen, I wonder if you can respond to that.
Okay, yes. I mean, to bridge those two questions, I'm not keen on the idea of imposed data sets on the third sector. I think the intention may be good. The result is that third sector organizations end up collecting data that doesn't help them do their work better, or indeed they're having demands. And so actually it is about actually helping organizations determine, as I think, to be fair, Ray was saying.
Oh, Stephen, you've just gone on mute there for some reason.
I'm sorry about that. And I think, so I think it's important to make sure that organizations start with what's the questions they want to answer, and then collectively we might want to think about, and this is a role that trusts and foundations can play, which is to bring people together to identify what are the questions collectively we want answered. So it's a collaborative endeavor, which is doesn't sound like such an easy answer, but actually it's the right answer to get there. And that then in turn helps us identify what are the questions that need a qualitative data response and what need a quantitative data response. So robustness comes from asking the right questions and then thinking about how we use that to make informed decisions. That's going to be my quick answer.
Thank you, Stephen. A question for well, for the whole panel, but I think certainly for Suzanne, is how do smaller organisations invest in or gain access to some of those academic partnerships that you talked about? How can smaller third sector or essential sector organisations have that kind of partnership? Is there a way for them to do that better?
Well, it's quite a tricky one in some ways for me, because I run a self-funding research centre. So to be absolutely honest, they have to be able to pay for our time. I mean, from my own perspective, so I just have to be honest about that. That said, academia is quite a kind of broad church, and there's a lot of academics who are not running self-funded research centres, but are actually sort of working in more mainstream sort of positions who don't necessarily need funding in quite the same way. So in other words, it depends what kind of academic you're working with, what exactly is required by way of resources. It can be more or less depending on the scale of the project and the particular position the academic is in. I do think the key thing is this point on impact that I made. Academics are increasingly under pressure, actually, quite rightly in my view, but under pressure to demonstrate impact through the ref and others. So if you have an idea that would be useful to get academic to set up an academic partnership on, and you can see a route to impacting on policy or practice, as Stephen's been saying, then that in itself is really valuable to the academics. So I wouldn't want to give the impression that, you know, resources is not important. I mean, you know, depending on the particular position of the academic, the time needs paid for, and that requires resources. That might mean that smaller organisations have to combine together in order to develop a brief, say, for, you know, I think going back again to something Stephen made about sort of a collaboration across the sector about key questions that need answered. It might make sense for a number of smaller organisations to come together to do a kind of more general commission. But I do think there is a real opportunity for, if you like, even more traditional academic departments and bits of the academy to engage more in this impactful research, because, yeah, whether you think it was cynical or not, it is actually more incentivised than it once was.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that's a bit of a call to action, really, within the essential sector, within the third sector and community organisations coming together to identify those questions that we perhaps want answered, and thinking and pursuing some of those partnerships. I think that would certainly make sense, particularly if I was to think about Audrey's position and the conversations that are happening with multiple organisations, often the same types of conversations, but that collaborative approach is hugely beneficial. I'm aware of the time, and it's whizzed by because we've got such an excellent panel and such brilliant questions that have come in. Just would like to say a huge thank you to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for asking me to chair this and for bringing this all together. A huge thank you to the experts that we have here on the panel. It's been excellent to have a conversation of this nature, and actually the chance to have nuance around what is evidence. Even the space to ask that question is often not given the space it requires. Please do read the report on the impact and the economic advantage and impact of the third sector by Ray, recently published by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It's all on the RSE's website, and this event will be online for you to watch back or to forward on if you're particularly keen for your colleagues to see it. But for now, thank you very much, and do keep in touch with RSE to be part of future events. Thank you.